Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for spiritual attack, spiritual warfare. Video is the fact of this concept that is really nothing new, and is the debate has always went on through society: is man basically good or basically evil? And when you live in societies where things are, particularly the 70s and 80s, where things are kind of okay, particularly for middle class white America, where you don't see the horrible corruption, the death and destruction done by doctors, military, etc. But, that surfer boy ignorance was pretty much beaten out of the population with the Vietnam War, where surfer boys were taken out and had their heads blown off in a war for no reason. So, the idyllic factor of that, and the fact that we're constantly at war, and this is nothing new. America has a war every 5 years, one way or another, almost constantly, which is kind of a cliche-ish almost joke from the book 1984, which kind of predicted this type of reality from a no economy. We have a military economy in the United States. There are military bases everywhere. The military feeds the police department and so many other areas, and this is where you get the entire problem that we have now with basically fascists that are running everything to the utmost degree, with a lot of funny, ironic things, because the guys that are all out there grabbing all the money now all came from the hippie generation and the dope generation, which is why marijuana and hallucinogens are being pushed out there, because these people grew up with it. And they then indoctrinate that into their fascist philosophy. And it has been pointed out in some interesting books, and of course Patreon members will have access to that book for free, is that in World War II, the Nazis were stoned out of their heads 24/7 on uppers, downers, and everything else. So while other armies were sleeping at night, they were all drugged out. Quite interesting how all these things happen. But let's get back into the nature of mankind. Now, this doesn't really have to do with any particular society or race. Every single society or race is intrinsically evil. We live in an environment that makes you, to survive, you have to become a warrior culture. Now, warrior cultures have been misinterpreted to the fact of having some sort of honor, some sort of code of ethics. This was started by, of course, the French, who have done all of this, who basically ruled most of the world up until the 1950s. Chivalry, or chevaliers, which is the French word for knight. Ritter is the French word, the German word for knight. And of course, we think that knights are only British guys because Americans grew up on these fantasy stories. The Brits are basically nothing more than Germans. But the understanding this and the actual principles that was transferred to knights, particularly in fictional literature, of course, was never really the case. War is not pretty. You don't give your enemies a break. You have to destroy them, and destroy them ultimately and completely, unless you want to fight them again. So this is a fantasy perpetrated on the masses. Now, this happened through the people particularly, and I don't really quite understand the viewpoint of people that were born in the 20s in poverty, who came over here as basically first generation Europeans and then looked at the world like this. But they were given breaks. The 40s and 50s were boom time. You just needed a high school education and could do anything. Houses were $20,000 and $30,000. Cars were $5,000. It goes on and on. So they grew up in this fake world. And this is particularly America. This changed radically pretty much in 1985, where housing prices doubled and tripled, which means your wages then started to not only not go up, they started to go down. So all of this happens, and to further understand where we're coming from, well, what does that have to do with good or bad? Well, when you underpay people, that's evil. They can't live properly. They can't take care of their children. They can't get medical care. This isn't about buying drugs and whores and having audacious automobiles. This is about living a proper lifestyle so you can eat better, live better, and take care of your family in a safe neighborhood. So as these things happen, society further and further decays. But is it new? It's always interesting that conservatives in particular want to go back in time. We all do this. Society screws us over, doesn't like us, and we don't want to believe in them, their religions they believe in. Well, these religions go back thousands of years. So you going back to your own culture, thinking that your culture, who created this scumbucket world we live in, is going to be better, is nonsense. But that's what we all do. You give up one practice and you look at, well, where can I go? Well, you go back. You look at things. You want to join pagan organization, old-styled organizations, some sort of order or group because you think that they have something when they don't. If they had something, the world would be a lot better. So it boils down to aligning yourself with some sort of gang. And that's how the world has always worked. There are no cities, countries, etc. If you go back and look at history, it's all about groups. This group or this order of people ruled this particular part of the world. They didn't call themselves particularly Italians or British or anything else. This is very new, where kind of countries were established. And we see that right now, particularly with the United Kingdom. Well, listen to that word, United Kingdom. Well, why did they have to be united to begin with? Well, that's because the English conquered the Scots and the Welsh, who are completely different societies, have completely different languages, etc. So here we are on one little island, and we have people that speak completely different languages, have completely different cultures. And then you have cultures that are very based in where they're at. And you have to understand that. The United States is no better. It's very much of a class culture. And of course, we have regional cultures. Eastern people of New England are very different than your New Yorker or your Southerners or your Westerners. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people in the United States that hate Californians, particularly people from Colorado, because Californians flooded into these states after fleeing from the horrible conditions in California. Super high prices, high taxes, and basically very bad policies that scream liberalism, but really only support the corporations. So there are particularly Coloradans who hunted Californians to beat them up and murder them. Never heard of that? Well, that's very typical. Of course you didn't hear about that. And that happens consistently. There were Southerners who used to murder anybody coming from New York, Connecticut, or New England that went through the hillbilly stage. They couldn't kill the black people. They were too easy to kill. So we're going to get one of them guys with them license plates and rape their children and their wives and murder them. This happened in the South all the time. Matter of fact, many people from New York, Connecticut, etc. that went down to help the blacks during the 1960s disappeared. So, hundreds of them. So, you need to understand that this is the world we're living in. So this fantasy you live in, that you try and hide in your corrupt, evil churches with your ministers who are basically debauchery scumbuckets who are screwing children and everybody else, these kind of people that have been Swaggart. Remember Jimmy Swaggart? Yeah. Well, I remember him too, and I did a little bit of ritual on him, and he got caught in my town, or close to my town, doing his perverted sexualities, picking up, $10 whores at bus stops. This is your good Christian. And it's no different in any other religions. So the whole idea is that you're living in a fantasy. The bottom line is nothing really has ever changed, and the entire world is all based on having a strong warrior society. Kind of strangely, there are some groups of people who have survived, who are complete pacifists, but are completely ignorant buffoons. Your Mennonites, what is the pendulum? It escapes me the terminology for the Pennsylvania Germans. They call them Dutch because they call themselves Deutschlanders, and people didn't understand that because nobody calls their country Deutschland unless you're an Arab Aryan. So the whole idea is that these people somehow survived, but they didn't survive because of the fact of their will to survive. They survived because they lived in societies who protected them for whatever strange and bizarre reason. I don't know why we would want to protect them. Similar to the conservative Jews who refused to fight in the Israeli army and live completely separate from other Jewish society. These kind of people should not be allowed to do that. You have to participate in society. But what is society? Now, I've recently been particularly watching on YouTube the channel, my memory's not too good these days. I think it's Kings and Generals Station. They talk about all the wars, and I find these very interesting. What was done, the fights involved, how massive groups of people came and from different areas and tried to conquer the world. Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun. The Romans, who were probably the best of the group, and of course, if they weren't out there fighting everybody, Rome in itself and the Italian peninsula there was invaded by all people and held for many, many years, particularly northern Italy, which is why you see a certain cultural familiarity of those were by the Celts. For hundreds of years, the Romans fought the Celts until finally they beat them and pushed them out of Italy. They originally conquered Italy and beat the, quote, Romans. I'm not sure who was in charge at that particular time. Generally, it was the Etruscans. But most of Italy was conquered by and ruled by the Celts. And the Romans, as I said, fought them for hundreds. Now, you don't understand that, do you? Because you haven't been taught anything of value. The worst scum on this planet is your teachers, who are just filthy little dictators who tell you lies. And they know it's lies, because it's impossible to learn history without this. But I gotta eat, I gotta put a house over, I'm gonna take care of my little brat kids who I'm gonna make as rotten as me. So they make sure they follow the system. The point is, you can't sit in Rome, you can't sit in Paris, you can't sit in Istanbul, otherwise known as Constantinople, which was taken by the Turks, the Islamic Empire. You can't sit anywhere, Phnom Penh, Saigon, Beijing. You can't sit there saying, I'm going to be a good religious person going for higher goals. You will be conquered and destroyed. Because what happens with all these wars is not the fact that Attila the Hun conquered non-Asian tribes. The first thing he did was conquer all of his own people. And this happens with anyone. The first place that all of these things start is with their own. So they're killing their neighbors first. That's how it works. And there has been constant war on this planet that you haven't been told about from the beginning of time, because that's what the human species is all about. You know, after kicking Islam out of Spain, who occupied it for 800 years and turned Spain into the pretty much the evil cesspool that it is, and warped those people with very energies, meaning evil energies that was left behind. What did the Spanish do after they kicked out the Muslims? They killed each other to take power and establish a kingdom there. If you talk about, let's go to remote places, Poi, Island Breezes, Diamond Head, Maui. Well, let's talk about the Polynesians. Well, the Polynesians and King Kamehameha, which is prized by the Polynesian people of Hawaii, was a king that went around and murdered everybody, very similar to what happened within the UK, the United Kingdom. There were a bunch of tribes, and they didn't want to follow him, and rightfully so. We generally all want to keep a rule to our own community. And I don't know if that's good or bad. It tends to be bad because communities build their evilness out and then start to victimize whoever they feel like. if there's understanding as a general rule, which could be called federal law, these things tend to work better, but it stifles people's freedom of speech. But King Kamehameha went to each island and killed everybody and put them under his rule. He united the Polynesian and Hawaiian islands through philosophy, through kahuna practices, great religion. Now, he murdered people to follow his way. And this is what happens all over. And again, there isn't communities. You read history and you hear about the Venetians, which were based in the Venice area, who had great fleets and who were warriors and who also were sold their services. You didn't hear about Italians. It wasn't northern Italy. It was the Venetians. This city built up a certain army and philosophy that went on. And this is typical of the entire world. People don't understand that. In the Crusades, there was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was not part of any country. There were no countries in the Middle East until the British did it after World War I and just kind of went around and said, let's have a cup of tea and we'll call this place Saudi Arab land. We'll call this place Kuwaiti. And this is the kind of stuff the British did. And of course, there's no way to win at that because every tribe that doesn't get or is taken something away from them will turn into an aspect of being against you. But what does this mean? If you can't have a society based on religion and peacefulness, I believe Tibet has been invaded 6, 7, 8 times. The Chinese are the last. Before that, I believe it was the British, and there was probably the Japanese, the Indians. I mean, the whole idea is that there's nothing. So you can't sit even in a mountaintop place, relatively isolated, without armies coming in there. The British went in there particularly and massacred all sorts of people. And of course, Britain seems to be a buddy, thinking that they are Westerners when they're really Germans who are Arabs. And of course, they have come to spread their evil on the world through the Western countries who tried to be civilized. Only the French were relatively civilized, and when Napoleon was finally defeated with his great plans and ideas, well, that went out the door. And who defeated them? Well, it was the Islamic Empire, who are basically the German, Russian, Turkish empire that has been influencing the world for the last few hundred years. So once Napoleon was defeated, all of Europe was in great peril. So, and of course the French and the Germans, otherwise known as the English, have been fighting for hundreds of years, and the British think they own some of continental Europe, not just their little island. So these are all the problems that people don't understand real history. There are no good people or good practices. You can't go around the world saying that anybody was great. People like to fantasize that the American Indians were so spiritual and wonderful. They spent most of their time murdering each other. And when they fought the white man, they were notorious for their horrible tortures and rapes and kidnapping of women in general and using them. And they actually raped women to death. And they raped children to death. Oh, we thank you, Great Spirit, for taking care of us. Let's go kill a buffalo and pray over the dead carcass. Let's not figure out how to grow stuff, because they never got out of the Stone Age. We certainly don't want to give white man, who gave the Indians blankets full of smallpox, and give them any kind of great pleasure either. There's certainly nothing great about them, who were basically British Germans who did most of that. So the whole idea is that this is the same type of things, not to mention killing their own people, which highly corrupt that the military was and is today. So we go through that, and of course killing each other. The Civil War, one battle, 50,000 men were killed in, the entire death toll in Vietnam over 10 years. So all of this needs to be understood. And what does all this mean? Where does this come from? Why does mankind, and something, of course, anyone who really feels they're not part of this reality, which I don't, because I don't think anything like anybody else on this planet, you want to be one of them. I want to wear jeans and t-shirts. I want the crowd to accept me. I don't want to be put upon. Well, I personally never did that. And of course paid for that as well. I had gangs following me pretty much all of my life trying to kill me. You know, white suburban gangs, Mickey and Mikey, who then came in gangs. So they wouldn't fight me alone because they know I'd kick their butts. So they'd bring 20 or 30 of them right up to my front door in Manchester, Connecticut. You know, the hood where the bad guy was. Well, I know what you went through, and I always consider myself the white nigger. But the point is that this is what's going on. This is the evil that is within people. So this evil perpetrates everything and makes no sense. Now, if we're going to talk about evil, evil goes against the basic instructional nature of us, which is survival. Now, if you're going to survive, what do you need to do? I got to be smart and have tools and guns and lots of spam, cans of spam by the hundreds. I'm going to live on that in a hole into that. And anybody that comes after me, my fellow humans, I'm going to blow his head off. Probably cut his eyes out, murder his children, because I got to survive. I mean, this is the mentality of survivalists. They don't care. They're not looking to help mankind or restructure things. They're looking to survive, and that means you die, I live. You need food? Tough. I bought the food. You're going to die. So how does this in any way make sense if we're going to go through this ridiculous understanding of evolution, which, by the way, has been proven to be completely and totally false? No archaeological finds justify that. We have bones of Homo sapien that go back 5 million years. You missed that? Dorian. You missed that, Dorian? Nonsense. Who, by the way, I believe denounced his belief systems close to his death, like so many other people did. So, and it's amazing to listen to these who make sure that they counter-state what they've said all their lives. So, very bizarre. And of course, Einstein didn't invent anything. He took an old theory and explained it a little better. Who was basically a retard, Einstein, by the way. They thought he should be put in an institution as a child because he was so stupid. So, there is no great cultures. Nobody shows that. The people want to talk about the invading white man into North America. Well, yes, to a degree. So, but the Indians killed every white man that came here. The Vikings couldn't establish any kind of colonies because the Indians murdered them. Now, it's a big country. They could have allowed people in, but do you want to allow them in? Is that a good idea? I mean, they're going to build their own people. They're going to come after you in some day. Doesn't it make sense to wipe them out? Jamestown was wiped out. The Indians have admitted that. They have lost groups of people. And well, what happened to them? Your scholars. They were tomahawked to death, baby. By the loving Indians who just wanted to pray to the great God out there. The great spirit that's in the buffalo I just chopped up and killed. Yeah, can't grow food, that would be work, but I could hunt the buffalo. So the whole idea is that everybody is infected with evil, and there's not a single culture that we can find that isn't, because you wouldn't survive. The people who survived the longest out there pushing their will are the Romans, and that's because they were so smart and such good fighters. So the whole idea is they were able to do everything, but they really got corrupted. What did the Romans make the Roman Empire fall? They fought each other, constant civil wars. A general would go out like the great Germani who conquered all this area of Europe. He'd come back and say, I'm emperor now. I did all the fighting. I deserve to run the country. This is how it works. So civil war after civil war. It's amazing they lasted, 800 years or 600 years? I don't quite recall. But it really doesn't matter because you're going to get into those types of fights. And again, the Romans fought for 100 years against the Celts who invaded northern Italy, as I just stated. I repeat that because memorize that. That's fact. That can be proven. So you just don't know that because you were taught by imbeciles, otherwise known as teachers. Let's get back to this Windigo. Now, Windigo is an interesting term. They've even made a movie of this. I'm trying to find it somewhere. But Windigo is a term, or wetiko is a northern Indian Native American term in the eastern United States bordering into Canada, which is a quite fascinating story. And I got involved in this because there's actually a book out there called Wetiko, Wetiko, by a particular writer who is a very particular. I've listened to this writer. Now, the name of the book is Dispelling Wetiko, is how you pronounce it, Breaking the Curse of Evil, which by Paul Levy. I've listened to Paul Levy on No Proof Allowed, Jeffrey Mishlove show, which is such a bastardization of alternative philosophy that it isn't even worth listening to. He likes to support Nazis and other people, even though he's Jewish, and gives them a ground to talk. I mean, it's just, but he never proves anything and never says anything. That's another story I've already talked about. But I've listened to this guy on several occasions on his show, and he does have good interviews because they're long enough. You know, they're not 5-minute nonsense that you get on some sort of media or TV show, if you would see these people to begin with. And listen to him, and he thinks everything is a metaphysical experience, which is not really what his books say. Now, this is the problem with the thinking that we have right now, because we are stuck in this pretty much 1850 and up thinking, which has been perpetrated by basically Islamic, Germanic, Russian thinking philosophies where these people come from, because these are basically so-called Deutschlanders. And the point is that these are people that are Austrians and Germans who put together learning institutions that gave people a certain foundation. The unfortunate fact is they gave them wrong foundations and then piled on with this, and I hate to say it, but a lot of this also has the dogmatic Jewish attitude towards it. If you listen to conservative Jews, who I basically like, and I'm a great supporter of Israel and of Jewish thinking, basically. I mean, these are people that have spent their time thinking and working in those atmospheres because they weren't allowed to go into regular society, creating a whole unique thinking pattern in people that went to universities and learned from them. But you're learning dogma of that time, and that's why nothing really works today. Yes, we have some basic understandings, but past that, it gets worse and worse into corruption and evil. So this basically Deutschland Jewish understanding, which is basically Middle Eastern philosophies that have toxified the West and have used this as a spear and hammer to really destroy civilization, because that's where it comes from. And of course, wetiko really is a belief system that comes from the Middle East. And this is where we have the problems. The really advanced, the most advanced societies we have to this day are basically the cultures of Central and South America. These were infected by the Aztecs and Mayans, who then were taken over, ironically and strangely, by reptilian god forms. And that's what we have, and that's what they show as their god. So they have all the great knowledge goes back to North, South, and Central America. That's where the birth of everything comes from. Other areas, of course, were the Egyptians, which were very unique in their particular philosophy. But again, they were a particular group of people in ancient times. And as they got closer and closer to modern times, they become less and less sophisticated because they get indoctrinated with the unfortunate problems of the Middle East and where it comes from. But the greatest societies really dwarfing the Egyptians were these central. But all we remember them for is mass human sacrifice. They go into decadence. The blood was fed on by extraterrestrial vampires who destroyed that society. So we don't give them any credit. And of course, the bottom line is that the documents they had by the hundreds of thousands, probably millions, were all destroyed by the front line of the evil, which is the actual Spanish, who really aren't Spanish, they're actually Middle Eastern people because Spain was occupied for close to, you could call it 1,000 years by Islam. So it's 700 to 800 years technically, but the blood is there, and that's why these people have the kind of what we consider Latin looking. There were no Europeans that were Latin looking. This came from the Arabs, Islam, who occupied Spain. Now, this is a fact. This has nothing to do with good, bad, or anybody else. I don't really like anybody. And as I said, there are no good cultures. The entire world is a warrior culture, and when you fight long enough, it's just about killing. It really doesn't matter. It becomes your job, just like you work in a slaughterhouse. You don't think about those animals you've just butchered. It's your job, and that's what the military does. And they don't care who they kill, and anyone who's ever known a professional military man will get that from it. It has nothing to do with God, country, and honor, those fake Marine Corps commercials you get tapping on the ignorant, low middle class people that join the military. This is about murdering people, and you murder people where you're told to murder people, not based on anything of value. And of course, that's why in the Middle East, which has no value to us whatsoever, except making people richer through the use of oil. But there's plenty of oil in Central and South America. Why aren't we there taking that oil? It's ridiculous, or at least buying it. It's absurd. Mexico has huge amounts of oil. We don't need Saudi Arabia. Why are we paying these people? This is all part of this evil current in people. So getting back to this nature of mankind, I mean, it's irrefutable. We don't have a long history of doing anything positive. We have a long history of military adventures, military technologies, and then we like to say, yeah, because we're in the military, we got this tool. Because NASA is out there spending trillions of dollars. Yeah, we got aluminum foil. And so the whole idea is these kind of nonsense things that we could have taken that money, put it into pure research, and developed some amazing things. But we don't have a city that is all hospitals, all rejuvenation centers. We don't have big anything. But we have big aircraft carriers. We have military bases everywhere. So we don't really have anything to show, even for which would be normal. If we're worried about survival, why don't we have all of our money going into medical research so we can live longer? Well, we don't. Our money goes into destructive, evil things that make us sick. And to show you the extent of evil, well, oil popped out of the ground. It used to sit on the top of the ground and nobody knew what to do with it. Oil was basically worthless. There was too much of it. It was a nuisance. Nobody used it. Eventually, the stuff that used to just sit there, someone figured out how to use it. And this is what started this. But the point is that energy is basically free. We can use solar energy. We can use energy from under the ground. Don't have to use oil, which can be used for so many things, to burn, as we're doing now, of a very precious commodity. Only evil would do that. Only evil would take high-level, important substances and waste them for momentary profit. So, what do we have? How can we say about all this stuff? You're not doing anything as a society to take better care of yourself. We should basically, anyone that throws a piece of paper in a stream or someplace that we have to live off of that oil should be shunned, imprisoned, and probably executed for such a horrific crime against nature. Yet it happens all the time. You dump your stuff in your rivers and your oceans that create oxygen and food, and nobody cares. Well, isn't that really going against what is the basic instinct of survival? Isn't that Darwinian survival of the fittest, that you're going to take care of your environment? Well, no, this is a psychotic energy of destruction that is within the human race in particular, who I believe has been engineered to be this way from day one. But we notice this even with primates, all primates. And by the way, chimpanzees are meat eaters. Do you know that? Do you know that chimpanzees are meat eaters? They murder and they rape. Those are the things closest to humans, so they say. They say there's only a 1% difference. Well, I don't buy that in a whole bunch of things, but it doesn't matter whether it's 1% or 20% or whatever difference it is. The primates, and almost all of them, are sexual fiends, murderers, and they eat meat. So this has been proven time and time again. Now, you haven't been told that by your ignorant pig teachers who are really hurting a populace by giving them fraudulent information. So, and don't tell me that's your job. That's what the guards at Auschwitz said. And they should have all been hung, as well as the entire population that supported that. So that's not a good enough excuse. So you don't understand that the closest animals to us, who are considered animals, which are a different species really, because Homo sapiens are species unto themselves, because why aren't monkeys evolving? Why aren't they now like us, if evolution was true? Well, it isn't. It's a faulty way of looking at things, backed up by these overeducated, imbecilic morons that think they know something. So as we move into these areas, we need to fully understand what is happening, and you don't get it. Now, let's get into this fact of that a society that is self-destructive wouldn't work. I mean, this is one of the problems with non-replicating species. While I don't necessarily have a problem with homosexuality, anything that is homosexual will die out. So it can't perpetrate itself. And if it doesn't perpetrate itself, it means ultimately it lacks a certain amount of truth of the fact of being there. So if everybody was homosexual, the society would cease to exist. Homosexuals use heterosexuals to carry eggs and have babies and adopt things. But they couldn't do it themselves. You can't take one of the same and do it. This used to be the fact with plants. And for many years, I used to grow fruit trees and other things. And you had to get I think this has changed, but you had to get a female pear tree and a male pear tree. And you had to then, if you had problems with fertilization, you had to take a paintbrush and you would go to the flowers and you would actually brush on from the different plants that were different sexes, so to speak, to get the fruit to germinate. So the species, even in the plant world, is pretty much the same. So this is something that is completely and totally self-destructive. Yet 40 to 60% of the population is homosexual now. Now, this may be a reaction to the overpopulation of the human species. And human sexuality is very bizarre, and people tend to be intrinsically homosexual because the sex drive, I should say bisexual, because the sex drive is so strong. So it's becoming more and more in the population. I would say another 50 to 60 years, bisexuality will be the norm. It's perpetrated on pretty much everywhere in the sexual culture, that there's a huge amount and a bisexuality, and it's one of those things that makes sexuality kind of intriguing. It's a big taboo, and taboo sex of all type is very popular because sex is boring. So the whole idea is that we have to look at these and analyze what is going on here. Now let's get back to this very interesting area of wetiko, or the Windigo. Now, Windigo is the term that most people, this wetiko is another term, and as I said, this was Native Americans who came up with this. And this particular area is very fascinating, that they had people who were inhabited, taken over by, possessed, cannibalistic, blood-drinking spirits. Talk about vampirism. I mean, it's very interesting that we have these vampire myths, which we have made into heroes again. Kind of typical. So everybody should be a vampire, right? Because they're such good, positive people. Well, in terms of society, they are. What do? They kill, they have extra abilities, and they're very sexual. Perfect, just like James Bond. What does James Bond do? He kills people and screws. But he's doing it for the good guys. The German Brit. Who the British have murdered more people probably than anybody of cultures with their colonialism, where they have killed millions of people for colonial, not even for war things. This is not a protection, but for colonial ideas, to steal the goods from somebody else. So this wetiko is a fascinating thing to look at. Now the problem with Paul Levy is that he is the typical caught up Jewish German type Arab that is stuck in this Freudian Wilhelm Reich nonsense that has been perpetrated through their schools of disinformation to toxify world populations. So he's not talking about some outside spirit that comes into you. And that's what I'm talking about here. What we're talking about is an outside force that is perverting the natural laws of society by making them self-destructive. Now, this seems to me is so aberrant, so bizarre, so weird that it must be done for a particular reason. It's parasitical in nature. But the problem with parasites is that they are very much into survival. They will do whatever it takes to reproduce. It's interesting that the rabies virus or parasitical nature of it, before you die of rabies, you get extremely sexually aroused because they want to pass on their toxins to someone else. Isn't that fascinating? This tends to be the case with parasites in general. They have hooked into sexuality to transfer things, because what is the greatest need in this society? Or compulsion, I should say. It's not really a need, it's a compulsion for basically no purpose whatsoever. Beyond keeping the species going, sexuality has no value whatsoever. Yeah, it feels good. A lot of things feel good, and that's why people are dying every day from poisoned drugs, because they want to live in a feel-good state. And your mind programs you to do that, or the parasites within you program to do that, and so forth. So we get into these realities here that here is an outside force, the wetiko, who comes into you and forces you to act in their way, just like the parasites force you to kill yourself. Now, those, of course, who in Patreon have gotten my information on parasites in the very interesting book that has recently been published by another author on parasites, which completely and totally control you into a very negative state of operating. It makes you pathologically sexual, violent, and everything else. And it all adds up that parasites is how you're functioning as a human being. The parasites within you, combined with the funguses and viruses, totally control your life. They tell you what to do. They produce strong chemicals that you cannot fight. You do what they tell you to do. Sexuality is based on a complete and total lack of personal care and survival. People are having sex, endangering their lives constantly. Pandemic sexual diseases continue to rage and actually are going up. People don't talk about this now, but people are using condoms and other protections less. Not to mention there are still tens of millions of AIDS people out there that are getting no help. The bottom line is that people have sex, and at the very least, they're endangering their life for 18 to 20 years, because if you have a child, if you get pregnant, you have 18 to 20 years to think about it, costing you tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and burdening and changing your life radically. Once you have a child, your entire life changes. And people, I had 1/10 of a second of orgasm. It was wonderful. Now I could think about it for 20 years and pay hundreds of thousands of dollars. So how does that make any sense? Well, that makes sense because the parasites within you are telling you to do that. That's how it's working. So all of that is frightening when you think about it. Now, the Native Americans said that they got this disease from the, quote, white man, or the Europeans, because a lot of Europeans are not, quote, white. You got to remember, there's an entire group of people that call themselves Aryans, which are Arabs. That's what an Aryan is. They come from Iran. They consider themselves Persians or whatever the society there is not. But generally, we say the Middle East, you're Arabs. So the whole idea, they think like that, they act like that, their language is like that, they write and push all their words together like Arabic writing. They're the only people in Europe that do that. And any Arab that speaks Persian can understand German. Doesn't that say it all? So the point is that's what the understanding would have to be. So a lot of these people that were inflicting that were either British, who are mostly German, or the Germans in general, who have infected most of the world. But, again, nobody is blameless. Certainly the Chinese murder more people than anybody. The number one murderer of people in this day and age is Pakistan and Iran. They execute more people than it. Closely followed by China. And then the top 10 is Texas. That great state of Texas. So the whole idea is that who murder more people than anywhere else. So governmental murder, by the way. So this energy, and as I said, Paul Levine, unfortunately, is stuck in that. He thinks this is just part of your darker soul, etc. But the kind of depravity that this evil does is way beyond just misunderstanding what's happening. Secondly, I don't know of anybody who really doesn't know what good is. We are born intrinsically understanding that you shouldn't hurt others. It's not good. You don't have to be taught by some crap religion to tell you, well, you shouldn't rob and rape and murder. I didn't know that, priest. I was just butchering my neighbor here for fun, and it didn't occur to me until it was written in this here book that it was wrong. This is the kind of ignorancy that to think that you have to go to and follow somebody that tells you how to act every day doesn't work. Because you know what to do and you don't do it. So you're choosing to be evil, and the fact that you go to a church and say, I'm trying to be better, isn't any help. As a matter of fact, it's an enabler. One of the reasons Christianity took off is because they said, hey, don't worry about it. You murder that entire village of people. You're still going to go to heaven. Christ loves you. So the whole idea is this is what goes on with this kind. But where does this kind of perverted thinking come from? Does it come from nature? Well, there isn't any homosexual species in nature that is still alive today. So it all reproduces. Some have reproductions that create immortality in the species of them. And there are some species that have been surviving for thousands of years. Certain types of, not fish, but what are they? But they reproduce by themselves. So it doesn't make any sense. And if we're going to go on to the fact that one species creates another, and this goes on, and we build and we're supposedly adapt to our environment better, this has to go with the fact of not doing things. If you produced an animal that ate all the foliage and there was none left, well, that species would die out. And would anybody replace that? Well, I'm not sure it would. Certainly nothing has replaced the dinosaurs who've been gone for, 10, 15, 20 million years. Why didn't they come back? No, they didn't come back because of the fact they destroyed everything. Their entire society was destroyed. So it doesn't make any sense. And this is not your dark side. This isn't some Freudian nonsense that would have been perpetrated by these pseudo-intellectual, overeducated, under-intelligent people who have been brainwashed by this pseudo-Indo-European philosophies that have plagued the world. These nut jobs, the Martin Luthers, all these people who have perpetrated evil thinking on the rest of the world and indoctrinated people into it. So this is an outside force that enters people, takes them over, and is fueled by and implanted with parasites, funguses, and viruses who control everything you do. These parasites go into your brain, and they have traced fish and other things. Fish will actually commit suicide. The parasites who want to go on to another host will tell the fish to go up to the top of the water where birds can eat them. Isn't that mind-boggling? It goes on, and those people who are really interested should become Patreon members and listen to this book that we've put up an audio version of on Patreon, which you should be supporting this organization in general with a small amount of money monthly so we can do our important research and develop things that don't talk about this but change it. Let's kill the parasites within you using advanced technologies. So make sure you subscribe to this channel, make sure you like this audio, and make sure that you join Patreon for a few dollars a month that really everybody can afford. And if you can't afford it, stop buying candy bars, cigarettes, or maybe drive a little less so you have $5 to help out this organization. So this is what happens. It's not this dark side of you yourself. This is an invading factor. It doesn't make any logical sense that people are self-destructive. It doesn't make any sense that people would be homosexual, unable to produce their race again, yet 60% of the population is mostly homosexual and bisexual, with at least 30% guaranteed. I've watched this for many years. Find anybody you know where there's 3 members of that family, 3 brothers and sisters. Doesn't matter what the makeup of those 3 children are. I can guarantee you that one of them is gay. So why is this happening? Is this some sort of hybrid, even parasitic nature trying to keep down the number of hosts? Well, that doesn't even make sense either. You want to have more. But there certainly is plenty of people on this planet, and we don't seem to have a shortage of people having children, since there's over 8 billion of us and growing rapidly. So it doesn't seem to be something that the hosts are particularly. Now, transferring and, of course, making a hypersexual subgroup of society is very effective for them. So, and this, of course, the problem with heterosexuality has always been the fact of having children, which are difficult to take care of, support, and even survive with. So bisexuality is kind of normal if you have a high sex drive, and this goes back to the pagan times where I think it's Tacitus, the Roman, talked about, particularly the Celts, of how they were so homosexual, even though they considered their women to be attractive. Well, they didn't want 50 kids and to really bother with female sexuality. They wanted it here and now and this. And this happens with, ironically, the warrior groups of people. The Spartans were notoriously had, as part of a weird sexuality. It wasn't considered your main sexuality, but you had young boys that cleaned your weapons, came with you to the battlefield, and also took care of your sexual needs. The same thing happened with the samurai. And I probably can find any warrior cult out there were bisexual at the very least. Ironically, a group of homosexual warriors, lovers, mates together in Athens, fought the Spartans and kicked their butts. And this was one of the last battles the Spartans ever fought because they were so badly beaten by this group of gays that got together and fought this great warrior cult who was supposedly so manly. So again, here we go. This is not in any way a condemnation. I don't think people choose their sexuality, but it's happening more and more. You can develop sexuality, and this happens constantly. So it is intrinsic within male, very screwed up sexuality that males have, that they can adapt to most sexual environments. And if that includes the availability of more partners because you're bisexual, well, that's going to happen, and it is happening. This is a major part of the new sexuality. So, does that make sense? Well, it makes sense if you're trying to pass on your toxins, your parasitic nature, your viruses, your funguses. Well, it doesn't matter how you get it there. You're not involved in the sexuality. You ain't getting pleasure from it. You're just surviving. So, this stuff that comes from your lower self has nothing to do with you. These are outside invaders. They could be extraterrestrial in nature. But of course, this is not a new situation. This has been since there's been mankind, period. But if you live thousands of years as an extraterrestrial species, you don't really care that it was 1,000 years ago that this society. And we got to remember, it hasn't been that long. Well, 1,000 years is a long time in human development, about 10 generations. It is not to someone who lives hundreds of years. So if you go away and plant some seeds and you go back and mess with them again, well, so what? You'll come back in 500 years and it'll be a playground or whatever you want to happen there. So, and we can't think that there's any great morality or that the extraterrestrials themselves aren't parasitical in nature. Most likely they are. And most likely the entire universe is infected with parasites. This kind of functioning on a planet that is perfect for life, again, makes no sense because so few worlds are. We look at our basic solar system, and there's nothing out there that can support life whatsoever, even of any type whatsoever, except maybe primitive bacterias, etc. There's no way you can live in hydrogen gas. Mars is cold and dead. Now, whether there was life on there thousands of years ago is not the issue right now, but there are very few places in the entire universe that have planets in the Goldilocks understanding, which is this kind of perfect environment. Even though there's so many, there must be. And what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they want to contact a psychotic murdering race like Earth, well, you have to be pretty stupid to come here. And if you have an Earth-like planet, eat your own chocolate, protect yourself, and don't bring madmen in. Why would you possibly want this species, which is full of disease and parasites and funguses and viruses, who does nothing but kill each other, why would you bring that into your house? I mean, really? How many here would invite in your local street gang to live in your house? Would you do that? Well, you'd have to be insane. Soon they'll be running the place and they will kill you and take over. Is that complicated? I don't think it's complicated. So this unfortunate Indo-European thinking that has perpetrated Western society and infected them continues to say that this is you, it's not the out. Well, they want, it's the deceptive game. Well, let's not look at really what's happening. Let's talk about the Doppelschaufe Freud. Oh, I'm crazy. I'm Freud. You will all believe me. This stuff about the subconscious and all. This is nothing that's new. This has all been known by the ancients and the ancient mystery schools, except the difference is they actually have ways of developing you past it. But the bottom line is that ultimately everybody in this society will take the lower path. Whether you're a priest, a Buddha, a dummy lama, or whoever it is that you are, you will take the lower path, and that's the case. The Dalai Lama has several children. He eats meat all the time, drinks alcohol, and does all the things he's not supposed to because he ultimately goes into his lower self. Certainly, we can see that from all religions, and none of them are any better. We've certainly seen what the pious Catholics have done with the mass child molestations and all the other hideous things that the Christians have done. And certainly we go into all the other religions which aren't any better and may actually be even worse. But saying you're a peace and love belief system but not following it is probably worse. So as we understand the reality that we come from, we have to be very careful. Now, this evil spirit is very interesting, and the stories behind them where people of this particular tribal area were getting possessed by this demon. They were murdering their families. One particular instance was one Indian who ran into starvation problems. And it seems that starvation brings it on. But the fact that you would continue or further cannibalism goes against most belief systems, and cannibalism doesn't work. There's a certain interesting fact with cannibalism is that a certain parasitical virus nature of them drives you insane. If you eat other humans, you eventually have serious problems, even in small amounts. And this has been proven down in, I believe, in New Guinea and other places where there are tribes that practice cannibalism, and the people that do that get similar to mad cow's disease. Very interesting. As cows, again, when they eat themselves, they become insane. But this was common in this tribe, apparently. This spirit plagued them. And one person who was starving to death, there was food about 25 miles away, which is not far in those days. I mean, these are physical people who probably could do that walk there in a day. But he decided, because things were bleak, to kill his family and eat them instead of walk 25 miles. and this is a typical case where people of having different problems stimulated by lack of food, which is interesting, that it opened you up to this spirit who then took you and made you into a blood-drinking, flesh-eating cannibal. And there's been many cases of this. And there were even tribal leaders or shamans who particularly dealt with this. And of course, they were persecuted as well because you had to kill these suckers that were possessed by these spirits. Very, very fascinating. But what does that mean? Are there lesser or greater spirits that are affecting us now? I mean, you could say there's a bloodlust in this society. People torture peoples in prisons. They do all sorts of things, that living off the suffering of others, which is how demons survive in general. How do we look at all that? Now, this is very common. So this is an extreme example in this particular area. But I don't consider the evil done by some cannibal blood drinker any different than someone who massacres a whole bunch of Indians by giving them blankets full of smallpox. What kind of evil is that? And this goes on and on with that. So, there are stories where certain Indians, and of course Indians have been persecuted right up into the early 1900s in America, right up to World War I and even past that, persecuted in towns, tortured and murdered and everything else by the, quote, I hate to use that term, white, because probably they were Indo-Europeans that did most of this. So the British German types who are Indo-Europeans, otherwise known as Arabs. So we don't know who was doing what, but nobody has a particular good aspect to them. There's no culture that hasn't done that. But there are certainly cultures that seem to prefer to mass murder people as part of it, and easily infected and controlled. So what do we do about all this stuff? But this is the problem. If this parasitical nature has infected the universe, it means that those coming to visit us are going to be just as weak and possessed and controlled as we are. And that's the problem. To think that someone in the universe, and they may even be 1 million or 1 billion years ahead of us, since this area of the Milky Way is supposedly 2 billion years younger than the rest of the universe. Again, this is science that is based on what? Boobs. So we don't know that. But let's say we're just the same age and other people have grown up to similar aspects of us. Do you think it's any different there? Because life as we know it has to support, people who stand up, who have hands and feet. So they're going to be very similar to us. And the extraterrestrials we met, and a lot of them are very negative. They're working with negative governments, and they know it. They're using and abusing this particular planet by working with evil governments, which they're well aware of. You'd have to be stupid. So the whole idea is they're not any better. Generally, positive extraterrestrial races don't come here. They're not interested in it. This tends to be battlefield Earth, where positive races sometimes come to fight the negative ones. But this is a whole nother story. But the bottom line, it's unlikely that people have evolved much different. And they probably have the same parasites and the same evil. It's not coming from your consciousness. I think that people generally, consciousness is much more positive. It's warped by the invaders. I mean, generally, other than a very small percentage of the population, when people get high, stone drunk, they tend to be positive. They tend to be looking for good things. They don't tend to be that violent, crazy type that you hear about. Of course, there's people like that as well. But in general, the nature is perverted by these entities for their sick personal survival. So the bottom line is that means that people are intrinsically evil. It doesn't matter whether they're perverted or forced to do it or not. And we have to understand that this is probably pervasive throughout the universe. So the entire universe is very atropic in nature. It's breaking down, it's destroying, and through this process, through this sheer positive energetic, so to speak, of the informational energetic fields that create everything, new life comes up. But that life is then perverted yet again in a consistent cycle of rebirth of the positive and destruction by the negative. Just the way it is. There's no other way to look at it. There's nothing that we can look at that we can possibly state is in any way positive about society. And while people try and do good things, just remember the Amish. The Amish have really serious problems health-wise. They live on horrible diets. They have a huge problem with bestiality and incense, and they don't know nothing. They're living in the fake reality of a garbage Bible that teaches them nothing. Certainly, that doesn't keep you in line. When the parasite goes into you and tells you to act on these very primitive levels of sexuality and primitive eating ways, you have had it. And no amount of words and pseudo bogus energies that come from these texts are going to save you or prevent you from turning into a deviant. They're all deviants, and most religions have it. There's a huge problem in Mormonism with the fact of child molestation as well. I've heard case after case of Mormon leaders molesting teenagers and other children. It's intrinsic. It has nothing to do with Mormonism. It has nothing to do with Catholics, Jews. They're all doing the same evil practices, whether they're married or unmarried, etc. As the Mormon religion pushes humping to the highest degree, it doesn't stop the huge amount of homosexuals that are in that religion that they would murder if they could, and their deviant practices in general, as it doesn't stop any other religions. Religions that grow are those that sanctify this, look the other way, and actually support it. Islam does that with a lot of their perverse sexual practices. So they grow because they look the other way and actually encourage it. Islam and the founder stated that you could have sex slaves as part of it. Not other Muslims, but anybody who you could grab from other societies, you could do that. You could have slaves, you could torture them, you could rape them. After all, Muhammad married a 6-year-old and consummated the relationship at 8. So it is said. So it certainly isn't that. So wouldn't that be the religion that would tend to be the most popular and growing the most? Damn right it would. While other religions, people are waking up and finding how silly it is. If you can dominate everybody and screw everybody in the so-called family, man, woman, child, mothers, daughters, anybody possible, and this is sanctified by the religion itself, well, isn't that the perfect religion for the wetiko virus? So it finds its place, it grows, and it takes over society. So hopefully this has been a lot of food for thought. I could go on hours of discussing this. This is probably over most people's heads. It probably comes off as misunderstandings and so forth. I have no like or dislike of anybody. I don't really see the human race as worth anything or anybody in it. And I still have yet to find any, quote, groups of anybody who are worth anything. No matter what they are, there are no good anybody. Certainly there are a few good individuals, and quite frankly, I don't meet very many of those either. So the whole idea is, I really can't find a single person that I could say was a good person that I've ever met in my entire 60 plus years. Some people are nicer, some people are different, but I don't really see anybody balanced in any particular way, nor operating on a higher level. And what I find is people who just bend over to every force that comes at them because it's just easier. So that's the reality of it. I don't have any good. There's certainly homosexuals haven't learned from their own persecution to be less corrupt. I lived in a giant homosexual community of Palm Springs, and they were some of the most corrupt people that you'll ever meet. You would think. And you would think that the Chinese, after being butchered, 20 plus million of them by the Japanese in World War II, where they sent postcards home with the head of babies, and they loved to rape old women and babies, the great Japanese culture that they are. You think the Chinese would have learned from that and been less aggressive towards other cultures, like the butchering that the Chinese did to Tibetans. Well, they are just as bad, if not worse. The kind of atrocities committed by the Chinese on the actual Tibetans are, again, at a super high level. So all that suffering and this kind of stuff does to people is confirm that they have to act out the same types of things. So it's a perpetuating reality. So hopefully everybody gets this and you understand these outside forces. And these outside forces is something you have to guard against. There are many things you can do. You must cleanse your aura all the time with bath salts, regular salt, and with the advanced formulas you need to be using our energy cells to protect yourself from these outside influences that pervert you and cause you to do negative, dangerous things that could destroy your life and others. There are lots of things you can do, but ultimately it takes a high level of gnosis and gnosis practices to stay on the path that is the cosmic light, the solar light, the next level above human. And frankly, there ain't nothing worse than being a human. I can't think of anything on this planet or off this planet that is worse than the species on planet Earth. Plain and simple. And the Earth beings will find this out as they reach into space, and a lot of things have already disappeared, but there's going to be a fight back, and certainly I generally support the annihilation of planet Earth and everything on it. There's nothing here worth saving, and the planet has been irreparably destroyed now with radiation and other, that there really is no going back. It's just how fast we're going to decay. But you can guard against that, and there's nothing that you can do to change anything in the bigger picture. It's not about change, it's about escape. Gnosis is about learning what it takes to escape, not changing. You change yourself so build your escape capsule to get out, and that's the creation of higher energetic fields to become light bodies and go on to the next level. Part of that is fighting and killing to survive. And if you're not prepared to do that, then you ain't going to make it to the level above human. I hope that's clarified things. I'm sure that most people don't get it, but I'm the lone voice of Gnosis on a planet of filth and destruction, and hopefully you understand that. And maybe you don't understand it today, but maybe you'll understand it years from now, as I've had people come up to me and said, you were right. You were right about all those things you said, and I thought that this was just all nonsense. And most people will find that to be the case. I've told you things for years that now come to light as being right. So it's there. It's up to everybody to work together in their own sick, perverted way to try and keep some level of order over the horrible chaos that we have right now. We've tried to build order through laws and society, and these have actually made society worse because all we've done is breed corruption. As some philosophers have said, civilization breeds cruelty, and I think that is so true. Until next time.